Welcome to the Our Oakville podcast, where we discuss the importance of belonging in the place that you call home. These conversations are centered around a sense of belonging in the beautiful town of Oakville, Ontario, though the reflections and experiences shared are applicable across the globe.
Oakville, as we know it today, is rich in its history and modern traditions of many First Nations and Métis. We acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as being the rightful stewards and title holders of this land.
The views and opinions expressed are those of the podcast participants. Any content provided is of their opinion and may not reflect the opinions of the town of Oakville.
Our Oakville is for pride. In this episode, we discuss the significance of Pride Month and the importance of community inclusion for members of the 2S LGBTQ+ community.
Okay, everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the Our Oakville podcast. This episode is about how Oakville is for pride. Joining us today, I have three very special guests, one of whom is a guest host today. So the Our Oakville podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Oakville Public Library. And joining us as our guest host today, we have Marcus Logan. Marcus, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I'm Marcus Logan. I'm the Manager of Community Development and Engagement for the Oakville Public Library.
Excellent. And joining us for this conversation of pride, and I know you may be watching this in a few weeks, but this is June 2nd. Yesterday we kicked off June is Pride Month, so we have invited to the conversation two staff members two employees of the Positive Space Network, Matthew and Phi. Can you guys introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, folks. My name is Matthew. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the drop-in coordinator for Positive Space Network.
Hey, folks. My name is Phi. I use they or he pronouns. I am currently a consultant at the Positive Space Network, and I run QT BIPOC programs for 2S LGBTQ youth of color.
Great. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to try and step away from this conversation as much as possible. I really want to allow this to be an organic, shared conversation where we really get a chance to hear from the experts or those with experience in the area. And to kick us off, I'm going to send things over to Marcus. Marcus, I'm hoping you can give us a little bit of historical context into this conversation of pride in Oakville before we get going.
For sure, Daniel. But before we do that, I feel like we need to take some time and some space to recognize the recent discovery of 215 children in Kamloops, and I'm thinking very much about my Two-Spirit friends and family today, and it is also Indigenous Heritage Month. So I just want to recognize the grief and the pain of the families and the children in the historical context and generational trauma of residential schools here in Canada. So I acknowledge my friends and family who identify within the Indigenous First Nation Métis Inuit communities.
Thank you, Marcus.
So historical context. I am originally I grew up in Toronto, and my husband and I moved to the Burlington, Oakville area in 1998, actually, and I had been doing some LGBT work and HIV/AIDS prevention work in the Toronto area, and so we came from the big city into a smaller, what we considered at the time, and it was a smaller community, and so we were looking for the gay community and the queer community, and where are they? How do is there a program? Is there something that we can connect with so that we can be with our people and have some a sense of belonging and a sense of safety within our new community? So there really wasn't anything, but we were fortunate, or I was fortunate enough to be attached to or connected with the Halton Regional Sexual Health Clinic in Oakville. who had a mandate to support sexual health in the LGBT community at the time. And so we started there, we wrote a grant. We got a small grant from a community foundation to be able to put on our first Pride Day. And so we held that at Brunny Creek Provincial Park. And from there, it just kind of expanded into people in the community wanting more information, wanting to know how to support the 2S LGBT community within their practices, within their, the sexual health teams, within their mental health teams, because they were seeing, queer and trans folks back then, this was in 1999, coming to their facilities and trying to access mental health facilities and sexual health clinics and that sort of thing. So we really became, at first we were called the Halton Anti-Homophobia Committee. And so I assembled a small team of allies, and mostly allies at the time, because at the time there was not a sense of belonging or safety for queer and trans folks to actually be on a board or be participating, in the education and human rights work that we were trying to do, in terms of their employers not knowing or family not knowing, that sort of thing. So we had, it was mostly agency staff who their executive directors and boards gave permission to, attend monthly meetings and to do some advocating, create some curriculum. And so we grew and grew from there. So we were always looking for partners around grants to be our trustee. Savis was an excellent partner and always stood up and stood with us and was able to, be our trustee for some of our smaller grants. But as that education and that human rights seeking knowledge from the community continued, we really decided that it was time to, make an agency, and that we really needed some more structure around having a board and being a registered charity so that we could write grants and receive them ourselves and administrate them ourselves, and do some fundraising. And so we created the Halton Organization for Pride in Education, which dearly called HOPE, and we ran that for a long time. And within that, we created youth programs. That was my main focus. So we decided that we needed to have a youth group in every city and town in Halton. And so Milton, Acton, Burlington, Oakville, all got their own youth groups, and myself and one of our other staff members or other members of our boards was the facilitator. So I'm really excited to have our other two guests here because it's grown so much from when we started. So that just led into it was we were trying to create that sense of belonging. We were trying to create I remember, if you're talking about racism and if you're talking about poverty, you need to be talking about, the 2S LGBT community, because all of those social determinants of health and intersectionalities are in our population, in our community as well. And so I wanted to, I was pretty pushy in the region, and I think that's what my reputation is being sort of that disruptor and that pusher of things. So I got on committees, and we started to talk about sexuality and gender for a very long time. So that organization, after many years of doing it, for me and my family, it was pretty tough. I stuck my neck out in the region a lot to advocate for queer and trans youth and families and children. And that sometimes garnered a lot of negativity. And so, we have a file at home of death threats. We've had police involvement, police actually standing up with us, telling the community that when you do this, you're actually, hating and discriminating, and so people need to stop. So that took a toll after doing it for 15 or 20 years on me, and I decided that it was time to step down and let the organization go where it wanted to go. And so we did that. And then after a couple of years, that organization unfortunately dissolved, and the community kept calling back saying, at that time we had our positive space training, we were developing a certification program for agencies. And so even the 3 years that I took off, then I tried to retire, the community, the people that I had made contacts with in the agencies were still calling to say, can you just come in and do a talk? Can you come in and do a lunch and learn? Can we do come to our volunteer committee and talk about sexuality and gender? So it never really stopped, but it was less formal. We decided at the time then, I assembled the group again, same agencies, and this time, because we had been doing some work and, the world changed and got more woke, we were able to get some queer and trans folks on the board or in the committee to do the work too. So this time we decided to just create a network and not a formal organization, and this way we had a little bit of autonomy. So within that, we did another, 5 or 10 years of work there. Me as the executive director or CEO of both organizations, and we created the certification program. So we were, going into agencies and doing in-depth, intense work with around sexuality and gender for their employees, so they were able to support their employees better, but also their clients and customers that were coming in. One of my goals for that was to, we were seeing a lot of, in the practice, we were seeing a lot of, again, youth and a lot of families and children coming out earlier with sexuality and gender. And so, I remember, I always say this, at the beginning of doing this work, I would get families coming to me saying, my son is gay, fix him. And then years and years later, I would get families saying, my son or my child just came out as transgender. How do I support them? So it was an incredible shift in that sense of belonging and that sense of care and love that I felt from the community and from parents of children. So one of my goals was to, because we were a network, one of my goals was to get the Reach Out Center for Kids to be our trustee. And so we eventually did that. They picked us up and they housed us. And I believe Positive Space is still in that facility and attached to the Reach Out Center for Kids, which is where it should be. It landed right. And then, doing that work, we built the youth coordinator role. We built a number of different programs with staff. And just having that rock solid, there you go, rock solid agency behind us, we were able to not have to worry about funding. We were able to not have to worry about office space and telephone and all of those things that we needed to operate. Within that year, landing at Rock, we were one of the gems, I call it, that we were able to achieve was a 4-year Youth Opportunities Grant from the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and we were the first cohort to receive that grant. And that 4-year grant really, really opened up. I was able to hire a youth coordinator and other staff to do the work, so it wasn't just me and another volunteer doing it for the past 25 years. So that's a little bit of the context. I eventually retired again from it, knowing that there were some really excellent people coming up behind me. I identify as a gay, cis, white, privileged man, and so I really felt at the time that it was time for another voice, and I wanted to make space for our QT-POC folks to come in and other voices and other identities to come in and really take the work and really represent the community much better than I can as a white gay cis man. So that's a bit of the historical context. I know it was long-winded, and I apologize to other guests, but that's where we're coming from. And I'm really excited to have Phi and Matthew here because they are two positions and two people that we created a while ago. And Phi was actually one of my students during the work in my tenure at Positive Space Network. So There you go, Daniel.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'm sure listeners can now appreciate why we insisted that Marcus join us for this conversation as our guest host. I can give some context to you, Marcus, and I'm sure you've heard this before. But so I was born and raised in Burlington. I started working in community about 15 years ago. I actually had your number in my phone before I met you, because your cell phone was actually the number that youth could text.
That's right.
If they needed anything. So if they were coming out or if they had questions about their sexuality, we were informed. So I was working for a different municipality, city of Burlington, and that was one of the numbers that I had was Marcus Logan. So Marcus Logan's number was in my phone in the event that any youth sort of disclosed challenges or experiences that, they really needed some guidance with, that myself as a, young straight white male, I wasn't able to provide, but I had that number in my phone, and now I'm happy that I have it in there with you more as a friend, certainly. But yeah, for a long time I carried you as an asset before I even knew you, and I'm sure that was the experience for many young people in Burlington. So thank you for the decades of service, which has led us to the current iteration of Positive Space Network. And I think I'll throw my first question to you, Matthew. So you heard a little bit of history. I know you're doing drop-in programs currently with COVID that's restricted, but I wonder if you could speak to your general impression about the level of acceptance that we see in Oakville, or I suppose the broader Halton region, for your services.
Yeah, it's definitely, right now, especially during Pride Month, the amount of engagement within the community has been really big. We support youth, we support parents through our ongoing programming, and so it's been really nice to get to know folks within the community. The one blessing of things being virtual is that we've had folks from outside of the Halton region join in on some of our programming, so we get to hear some of the experiences that take place in some other areas. But generally, the levels of acceptance and engagement towards our programming has been fairly positive.
That's great to hear. Phi, a question for you. I know you mentioned that, I believe you said you were consulting on the QT BIPOC service portfolio. I wonder, is that something that you sort of see as the next steps for Pride and acceptance in Oakville, Halton, or if maybe you can just share a little bit of what work we still need to do?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I guess a little bit of context around me. So I do identify as non-binary. I'm Vietnamese Canadian. So I started out in Oakville, and I did most of my, childhood in Burlington. And growing up as someone from like the QT-POC or QT BIPOC community in Oakville, Burlington, I had my own challenges to experience. Growing up in a predominantly white community, there were a lot of times where I felt I didn't have connection or relationship to my culture. And I often felt like I had to kind of mask another part of my identity, for lack of better words. So over time, I went to school, I went to social work, and I came back to the region as a placement student for the Positive Space Network under Marcus and some other staff at the time. So I believe that was around 2016, 2017. And so I had my own lived experience at the time, and I went into the program really excited because when I was a student, I didn't really have much opportunity to connect or engage with any QT BIPOC youth, let alone any other 2S LGBTQ plus youth in the community. My school had a GSA, which I would occasionally go to, but there was no real place for me to hang out or meet other folks to just, talk about our identities or even just hang out. So when I heard about the Positive Space Network, I was really excited to be in a recreational environment with other youth. And so during my time there, I was asked to take on a project for my second semester. And I noticed that there was a few youth of color attending in the space. Now I know that there are, people of color in the Halton region, in Burlington, Oakville, Georgetown, Acton, Halton Hills. And I felt like it was really important for us to gather and connect with each other. So at the time, I started a GoFundMe with the help of the staff, and I was able to raise enough money to start what I called at the time a creative zine program. And this was an opportunity for youth in the QT BIPOC community to gather, to get creative, and to explore their identities without having to worry about microaggressions, and really just take that deep dive into culture and connection. So that was something I did as a placement student, and I've come back this past year to kind of bring that element back to the Positive Space Network. And it's been really cool for me to see all of the youth who are coming out now and to see how conversations have shifted, especially since I was a youth in high school. A lot of the youth now are very comfortable talking about things like microaggressions, racism, colonization, and how those things kind of affect their experiences of being 2S LGBTQ+. So I'm given the privilege to continue to try to create space for those youth so that they can talk about their experiences. And in addition, a lot of these youth, they feel that they don't belong in community, or they feel like they can't fully tell their stories. Because they don't have folks who they can identify with / mentorship, but they also don't really have a space to gather. So something I'm trying to focus on in my current role is to create a space for those youth to have those conversations around race, around identity, around sexuality and gender. And for those intersections, provide a perspective where they can realize that you can identify as part of the 2S LGBTQ+ community, and that you don't have to come out, and that it looks different for everyone, especially as a person of color. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to come back to Matthew here because, Phi, you mentioned the importance of finding that belonging and finding other people who are, having a shared experience. And I wonder, Matthew, if there are people listening, and they're looking to connect, or they're looking to identify with other, like experienced people, as drop-in coordinator with PSN, what are some resources you might point to, either families or individuals who are seeking for that level of connection and belonging?
Yeah, so we have some of our ongoing programs, which are the Connections program, which is for trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming youth. Within that program, we all come together right now because of COVID. It's done in breakout rooms. So we have one breakout room for the youth, and we have one for the parents. And so parents of the youth can also participate in that programming as like a mutual support group. We also have our parent and caregiver peer support group that takes place once a month. And then with our drop-ins being virtual, we've kind of switched over to a program-based structure at the time. So a lot of arts-based activities are happening online. We've partnered with the Milton Public Library over the summer to do a book club. We're doing some great events throughout kind of the last couple of weeks of June. We're doing like a drag robot workshop. So we're getting some supplies and doing like a virtual runway. So that'll be really fun for folks. We also, in May, we had our creative writing group called Rainbow Writes. That's co-facilitated by an individual who created that programming, and so we're really excited to have her coming back over the summer because it was a much demanded program. So all in all, we do have a lot of great offerings going on, which I'm really happy to be running and supporting, and they can always be found on our website, which is positivespacenetwork.ca.
Thanks, Matthew.
So Daniel, I'm
Yes, sir.
just listening to Matthew and Phi, and it strikes me about the providing the space, right, and feeling safe in that space, and how that creates the belonging. I remember when we started the Connections group, and it was it probably still is, Matthew, a pretty powerful space for families to gather and to get support, peer support from other families. And I just remember the great relationships that moms and dads and cousins were making, and their kids were making. And sometimes we would get participants or a family that would be coming every month for years and years and years, and then sometimes we would get a parent coming whose child just came out as trans the night before, and so sometimes it became really emotional, and we allowed that space to really happen around this is a safe space. And so when I hear Phi talk about identifying that space was not available for QT BIPOC folks, and creating that through the zine, and then through the programming that Positive Space doing and Matthew's doing with all of the other amazing things they do, I think it's really important that people understand that those spaces are sacred, and those spaces are safe, and those spaces create the belonging, right? And so we've been really good at creating those spaces, but it needs to happen out of those spaces as well. We need our youth and our families and our children to feel safe and belonging everywhere, in their schools, in their faiths, in their places of worship, everywhere.
Yeah, and Marcus, if I may, that is a thread that we have really tried to tie with all these episodes, is that the work of belonging is often the responsibility of maybe that who's experiencing a level of misunderstanding or lack of understanding. And we've tried to allow these conversations to sort of provide a little bit of filling that void of your misunderstandings or lack of understanding about a group that would allow, of course, them to feel a greater sense of belonging, but then as well as yourself to feel a greater sense of belonging with your built inclusion, with your built understanding. And I caught on to something Matthew said as well, as, you would have these groups with youth who have recently come out or identify somewhere on the 2S LGBTQ+, and in the other room would be their families. And oftentimes I think those conversations that's happening with the families, or the information that they're receiving, is maybe some of the information that folks listening need to hear. So what is it that residents need to know or need to hear in order to allow for Oakville or the greater Halton area to be more inclusive space, especially as we celebrate Pride? And I'll kind of leave that open to anyone who wants to chime in.
It's a big question.
It is a good question.
I would say in our virtual spaces, just really acknowledging where folks are in their journeys. As I mentioned, with things being virtual and parents being in another room with their youth, it's become a really inclusive space where you can ask any question and no question is kind of turned away or ignored. We have parents that will come in and they apologize for their vocabulary or the way that they're phrasing something, and we just want them to know that wherever you are in your journey, that's okay. And that's why these programs and supports exist, because we want to make sure that you're feeling as supported as possible throughout the journey. And that also goes for the youth as well. We often will have youth that are not sure of their identity and just want to come and hang out and, talk about some of their feelings or some of their thoughts. And the perks of us doing some arts-based programming is that they're able to express that differently than just having a conversation. They put it into artwork. They put it into, we just did rug hooking. So all of these neat activities that they can do really come to celebrate their identities.
Thank you. Phi, I'll ask you then, I guess, in addition to that, if someone's listening to this and maybe the area of pride is something that they don't have a great understanding of, where can someone start in terms of building their level of inclusion or understanding, or really just allowing for more belonging for these individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the beautiful thing about the age of social media right now is that we have these supercomputers at our fingertips. And so, there's great resources like LGBT Youth Line, for example, or EGAL, and they'll have a lot of resources on, terminology if you're not familiar with it, and also, issues. So, for example, with LGBT Youth Line, they do a report. And so it covers different areas like suburban areas, rural areas for, QT BIPOC folks, like all these different things. And they're youth-friendly reports. So, they're not like 100-page documents that you need hours to sift through. You can actually just spend a few minutes like going through these reports and, just develop your vocabulary and make those connections. I think another great thing that we're seeing these days is, TikTok. I think there's a lot of people who are using that platform to express their voice, and they're sharing, like willingly educating people about their identity and their needs and their wants. When I bring it back locally, at the Positive Space Network, we have YAC, so it's the Youth Action Committee, and all of the youth involved, they want to see change in their community. There are things that they would love to see. So I think it's time that institutions, adults, parents, caregivers, all of us really just listen to what these youth are saying. And, you might not always understand or know where someone's coming from, but the least you can do is offer that space for them to feel like they don't have judgment, where you can just hold that space for them to process out loud and to be themselves, and maybe take the time to come back to them, and reflect on what they're saying, tap into more of those other resources before you say something, just to kind of get comfortable with the content yourself. And like, I recognize that everyone's on a different part of their journey with that information and knowledge. In some communities, you might not know where to go or who to talk to access that information. But I do encourage that curiosity.
Thank you, Phi.
And Phi, I really love the comment about like listening to the youth, right? That for me, that's belonging. Like, we youth are the expert in themselves, really, right? Like, they might not fully understand, but their sexuality or gender right from the very beginning, but they are the experts. They know what they're feeling. They know what they're going through. We need to listen, and that creates the sense of belonging. I also want to just say, like, back a question ago, Daniel, that for me, just people should understand that, like, my sexuality, my gender is just one part of who makes me, right? So it doesn't always have to be focused on or excluding me because of that, right? I have other creative, funny, intelligent things to say and do in the world, and there are examples of really successful and high profile and people that are identifying as the 2S LGBT community. So it's not like it's just a part of me, right? And understand that I can have my spirituality and my sexuality sitting beside each other, and just love all of those parts of me. And that's the way to make me feel belonging.
Yeah. I what you just said, Marcus, I really agree with. I think that oftentimes, and Phi, you mentioned social media, people get so concerned about saying, doing the wrong thing, or they dilute people's identity down to one identifiable feature that they know about them, that I think I would encourage, and if there's one thing I've learned throughout the process of doing this podcast or even doing community work, it is just being humble in failure. right? So, or if you don't have information, or if you use the wrong terminology, or if your understanding is incorrect, just be humble about that. You don't necessarily always have to be defensive about something that you have a lack of information in, especially if that information is really pertinent to someone's identity, right? Allow them to have the space to correct you without it being an immense social issue. I think it's important that we all just make space for ourselves to be vulnerable to learning, and having that learning be okay, especially in circumstances where the stakes are so high, where your failure to be accepting is really causing harm to another individual. Just be humble in the fact that you do need to learn information. And in some issues, especially when it impacts another so much more than it impacts you, they are the expert. And what they need in order to feel included and feel like they belong. Now, Marcus, I'm going to throw the next question to you in regards to that. So we do often hear some of these issues play themselves out in the public eye. So yesterday, we saw many schools raise the pride flag to commemorate the start of Pride Month. And I hear the polarity regarding, this symbolism and the importance of this. And I'm hoping, just because I know you've had such a career of, having to really shake up the norm and be a disruptor, if you can maybe speak to why symbolism like that is so important.
Yeah, Daniel, you ask big questions. I have had a long career in this work, and I will say that the Catholic School Board has been a long time supporter and worked with us. In fact, was on our board at one point. And I know the teachers and the administration are all supportive and are really in the system right now, supporting the queer and trans youth that are in that system. I think, like, for me, I remember the first time, and I can't remember the year, it's probably like 2001, where we got the idea that, like, every municipality should be flying the flag. So we went, we gathered some youth who were interested in developing speaking skills and advocacy, and we went to each municipality, including the region, and did a delegation on June Pride Month, and then asked them to fly the flag. And so we had, and then I remember my husband and I going around that night to make sure that every municipality was flying them when they said they would. We did have one challenge with Halton Hills, and the response from the community was a human rights complaint, which we assisted in and won the case. And so they were made to fly the flag and changed their policies around flying the flag. So I just remember, people emailing and calling us at the office, or maybe even texting me. Maybe it was you, Daniel, texting me. Just when they drove by the city of Burlington and they saw the flag flying for the first time in their community, right? And they had been here in the community for years and years and years. So this is a very different time than what Positive Space is doing now. This was the coming out of queer culture in Halton, and the response was just like, they didn't really use the word belonging, but there was a lot of appreciation and thanks, and like, this is something good, right? Like, I'm being represented. That flag represents me, and people were feeling really good about it. So I think it is about flying the flag, but it is also about the other side of that. It is about worry about the youth and sending that message, that dual message, that we support you, but we're not going to do this piece for you. And what does that tell them? What does that say that they can still, like, that for me is not belonging, right? Especially when we're in 2021 and there's flags flying everywhere. Trans flags, the progress flag is being seen in lots of areas. In fact, the town uses that one now. So we just put up flags in all of our libraries, and there's one flying at the Centennial flagpole in front of Central Library where I work out of. So I don't know really how to answer that question, but I think it sends the wrong message that it's not 100% authentic, and it's not 100% supportive, and I think that sends the wrong message to youth and families and children that we can support you a little bit over here, but not 100%.
Do you mean that, like, in terms of like flying the flag as tokenism?
Yeah, I knew you were going to go down that road. I think maybe some of the other panelists can answer the question too, but like it is about. I think it's still a bit about, like, this situation is a little bit about control for me. It seems like control, right? They have the power to make that decision, and I believe it's the wrong decision, but. We have to live with it, and there's been an amazing community response to it, and so I think once this is what your listeners can be doing, right? It is that advocacy piece around that, like, question them, send them a message, write the letter, right, and write the school board letters and things. So the more they understand, people making these kind of decisions understand how exclusive and how hurtful and potentially damaging it is, I think that the better they'll be prepared to make different decisions.
Maybe Phi, Matthew, if you don't mind posing, I think we've seen, and Marcus mentioned at the beginning of our session, importance to commemorate and acknowledge the 215, the bodies of 215 children that have been recently identified in BC, and we're starting to see, children's shoes show up as a form of public solidarity and demonstration at historical public buildings, and that symbolism, how important it has been, as in terms of setting a narrative across the country that there is solidarity and pain that's being shared. Now, I'm curious, as those shoes have provided folks across Canada with an outlet to demonstrate their solidarity. And the conversation of flags certainly allows organizations to provide an outlet, while it, may be in fact symbolism in sometimes, or tokenism in some cases. It does allow for folks to provide solidarity. What can listeners do if they're listening now as a sign of solidarity in order to build that trust and acceptance that needs to happen in the community for folks of the 2S LGBTQ+ community to belong?
To answer your question, I'm just going to bounce off of Marcus a little bit first. So I think it's so important for youth, especially, like, symbols mean the world to youth. When you feel like you're alone and that no one else out there is like you, or when you're constantly being bullied and reminded of your difference, seeing that flag can make such a big difference in someone's life. So I think it's a starting point to put the flag, and one of the challenges in not putting the flag up is that the youth can get really frustrated, not to speak on behalf of them, but it can be really upsetting to not see the flag, because we all know that there's so many other systemic changes that need to be done. So as I was kind of mentioning earlier, it's so important to, like, really listen to those youth and, like Marcus was saying, advocate, like, for their needs. So for example, that might be something like all gender washrooms. The fact that some youth don't feel comfortable in their schools to use the washroom is denying them of a basic human right. So there are things that we can do, like writing a letter and providing space for the youth and using our own voices to contribute to the conversation. As for things that, folks aren't comfortable or familiar with, I'd like to pose a reflection question, right? Like, how many people in your personal social circle do you know that are part of the 2S LGBTQ+ community? Do you know anyone? Yes or no? And I'm not saying, tokenize it and have a friend of each different identity. What I'm trying to say is that it's so important to, like, spend your time with a diverse group of people, to be around different opinions, thoughts, and ideas, especially if you're in a position of power, because you have to understand that, especially as a youth, like, you're kind of limited in where your voice can go sometimes or where your voice is heard. But when you're in a position of power, like in an institution or an adult, there are things that you can even push for in your workplace to contribute to that conversation. It could be as simple as adding your pronouns to your email signature. That's something that takes a minute out of your day, but it's a start. And that's like a small piece contributing to the larger conversation. In terms of a symbol of solidarity at this point in time, I would just say, like, show up for your youth, like, ask how they're doing, hold that space for them. If you are privileged in a sense of financial stability, if you have any, money that you can contribute to organizations that do this work to support the youth, I think that's important as well.
Thank you. Matthew, is there anything you want to contribute to that?
I think Phi and Marcus really said it all. So just continue the allyship, make it authentic, because these youth and the parents in the community cannot survive without the support of the community as a whole.
Yeah, I feel kind of seen there, called out, Matthew, because well, I did invite you to this because we were going to be having a conversation to celebrate June as Pride Month, but you are not incorrect in that. That is something I think that, I mean, even when we were talking about aspects of symbolism and stuff. Half of us in this conversation work in the public sector, and even Positive Space Network is held through a public service entity, right? So we all have to navigate these systems of service and systems of the public sector. However, yeah, I do think that there needs to be a level of authenticity in the way that you're providing those services, and a lot of that isn't necessarily always just attributed to the organization, but to the individuals behind it. And which is great for, opportunities like Pride to be able to build relationships like this, where, Matthew, you and I have had brief conversations together, never anything as intimate as this. Phi and I have, I think, had one virtual conversation, never ever anything as intimate as this. However, Pride has given us the platform to be able to build and, have a meaningful conversation that I hope will serve towards our relationship and ultimately, our connection and better opportunity to share resources with Oakville residents, as I hope I'm able to do in my role. But you are correct, Matthew, is that the work is often on the individuals to go beyond the parade, the month, the special event, and to us LGBTQ plus people or youth, they need more than 1 month a year of support and inclusion. So, Marcus, I know I've been throwing the hard questions out at you. I'm not going to apologize.
It's good. I'll get you back
but
later.
I do. I'm noticing that we've been speaking for about 40 minutes now, and I want to give folks a chance to enjoy something else with, I'm sure, what is a beautiful day. But I want to give a question to you, Marcus. So, in terms of next steps, you fought a lot of battles in Halton to ensure that Pride exists. I love the story of you driving around, looking at municipal buildings and whether or not their flag is flying. I love the idea of you being, one of the first recipients of the Youth Opportunities Fund. I know that you and your partner were the first, if not one of the first, gay couples married in the town of Oakville.
We got our license here. Yes, we did.
What's that?
We got our marriage license here.
Yeah, which is so. I ask you, what's next? Say not all the listeners are just looking for a level of understanding to build inclusion and belonging and understanding. Maybe they're ready for the next step of, I hate to call it allyship, but they're looking for the next step of action. What is next for Oakville and Halton in terms of building a more accepting and inclusive space for Pride?
Yeah, I'm gonna, I can only talk from my perspective, and I'm gonna play off Phi's comment about educate yourself, right? Learn and understand that we are human beings. We have feelings and emotions. We bleed the same. We have an intersectionality that is just as beautiful as any other person, your neighbor, your teacher. Understand, just learn and understand that we are people and we're humans. And I think in terms of, I think Positive Space is doing a really great job with the QT BIPOC and the connections groups around gender and transgender identities. But I'd like to see, again, like the flags are flying in Oakville, and we've changed our images to reflect the number of celebrations as a corporation. But it is like, I'm not just gay in June, right? My family is not just gay in June. My children are not just from a gay family in June. They have to experience, the things that they've experienced around having two dads all year. And so I think it really is about acknowledging that we exist all year, and we're here. We're not going anywhere. We've existed for centuries as well. We've created families for centuries on our own. And I think the other, like the whole performative piece around, I'm probably not going to. I've been putting this out there a little bit, but I'm not a fan of rainbow crosswalks because they for me, it symbolize, like, that's a symbol, right? We're talking about a system not raising the flag, and then we have another piece where we're putting the rainbow flag on the roads where people drive over. And for me, it's a symbol of pride and struggle and resilience. And when I have to drive over it, it kind of like it makes me feel uncomfortable.
It's an interesting perspective.
I know it's not a very popular,
not
a very popular thought right now, but that's how I'm feeling and about that. And so, Phi mentioned about the symbols being very important, and I struggle with driving over a symbol of pride, but that's my thought. So I guess it really is around education and the understanding that we exist, we are creative, we are professionals, we are teachers and lawyers and politicians and students and children trying to grow up and be resilient and healthy adults.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. And yeah, that's a completely valid comment. We are all people, and for someone who has spent a large portion of their life defending what that flag ought to represent, I can completely understand how running your car over it may trigger just some misfiring in your brain. Phi and Matthew, I'm wondering if you can send folks off with a little bit of understanding in terms of how they can support Positive Space Network, and maybe how Positive Space Network could be of greater impact if they did receive additional supports.
Yeah, the one big component of it is honestly funding. Donations are crucial. We're so thankful to the community for doing a lot of fundraising, doing a lot of donations this month, because it is going right back into the community. Once we head out of here today, Phi and I are getting on the road and doing some gender-affirming gear drop-offs to youth that are in need, and that's at no cost because we put all of this funding back into the community. But all in all, like, the amount of work that we do with such a small team is incredible. Not to be boastful, but it is. I was also a placement student here at Positive Space Network last year. And one of the things that came up in conversation was that if I was a youth living in Burlington, which I was at the time that I was a placement student, the only support within the community would have been myself, because Positive Space Network is one of, if not the only, agency or organization that supports this community. And for a team of 4 to do this is incredible.
Yeah, I really just want to echo off of what Matthew and Marcus is saying. The advocacy for our program is so essential. The youth really need the space to gather, connect. It can be a difference of life or death at times to have these spaces, to have an environment to advocate for this work. I think that having an organization also serves its purpose to have that conversation and exist in the community. In terms of the work that folks can do at home, maybe after listening to this podcast, is continue to educate yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, and of course, I identified that, I'm a white, straight male. I do work in community, and I do consider myself to be an advocate and professional of belonging and what that takes in community. And oftentimes when we wrap up these conversations, I like to think about, or like to share the stakes. So we have seen a history, a really challenging history for folks seeking to come out as gay, lesbian, trans, and what that has done for folks across our country or even our local community. When the stakes are that high and what is really required from others is simply love and understanding, it becomes really challenging for me to not understand how that choice could be so difficult, right? When we see what occurs at those stakes, when someone is feeling so vulnerable based on who they love or how they feel, and when they often just need as others to simply understand, I really like to believe that we live in a town, in a community, where we can see and recognize that we have an easy choice there, that accepting another person for whom they love or how they feel can't be so difficult that they could undergo the turmoil and the difficulties that we've seen take place throughout our country over history. So I hope that those listening really take some accountability for their language and their actions and how they treat. And you may not immediately change how you feel, but how you treat other people in the community based off of and aspects of their identity that really does not concern you. And I hope that this conversation was something that you could enjoy, but certainly more importantly, something that you learned from. We all want Oakville to be the best city or best town to live in, and I would love to feel like those who I share the streets with and walk past are ready to make that decision towards being more inclusive if it doesn't come natural to them. Because the resources are out there, and as we've heard from Marcus, there's been people walking and making noise so you listen for decades. So you can't really act like you don't know. The information is out there. The conversations are being had every day, and these people are filling the places that you love to attend for work, the places that you love to go, the places that your children enjoy. Like this is all of a benefit to us if we can ensure that everyone feels a sense of belonging so that they can be their best self. And I hate the reality that someone would feel like they have to divert so much attention to justifying their identity when they could divert that attention to being, productive member of community. So certainly as you go about your day, just try to carry that with you of how we can do better to ensure that folks are loved regardless of who they love. Phi, I'll give you, if there's anything you wanted to end on, I'll turn it to you for the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Just thank you to everyone who is supporting our community, to everyone who is part of our community. Thank you for just being you and having these conversations when sometimes it feels like the world is against you. Continue to have these conversations, continue to find each other. Remember that Pride started off as a riot in 1969 with the Stonewall riots. So, we thank Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, and to continue their legacy and the work of just being who we are.
Thank you, Phi, and thank you everyone for listening, and we certainly encourage you to listen to more episodes of the Our Oakville podcast and develop your understanding of how you can be a better person and a better resident to ensure we all have a greater sense of belonging. Thank you.